Here's one approach to making multiple menus with D3. Here I can select different values from different menus, and both of these selections are tracked in our state. This builds conceptually off of the previous example with just one menu. This is also built in such a way that you could scale it to 3, 4, or more menus if you want to. Let's take a look at the code. Just like before, we start with our menu options, and we have a main function. This time we're using state.xcolumn and state.ycolumn as our properties for the menus. This code here uses the presence of state.xcolumn as an indication of whether or not both of these has been initialized. So if there is no state.xcolumn, then we define xcolumn and ycolumn based on just looking up values from these menu options here. Okay, that's how we initialize the state. Then we have our container and then our menus container, which I just wanted to have as a separate div, mainly so that I could style it with CSS to have display flex. Here's the CSS where the div that has a class of menus container within the UI elements container, and that's what the space is, by the way. Space in selectors is the descendant operator. If this is not display flex, then these menus appear on top of one another, which might be what you want. But in my case, I'm imagining that we want to have kind of a row of menus at the top of like a scatter plot or something. So that's what display flex does, and I put gap as 32. This is something that comes with flexbox. And if you haven't heard of flexbox, it is an amazing thing in CSS. I personally use flexbox pretty much all the time when I need to build out UIs with nested boxes as the layout. The way you trigger it is with display flex. And there's this site here, which is just so amazing, a complete guide to Flexbox. I always end up back on this site, when I have to figure out how to use it. So there's flex direction, flex wrap, all this various stuff. I love the visuals here. It's really nice. These are the different properties for justify content. So anyway, that's what Flexbox is. We're just scratching the surface. And there's another thing in here called gap, which is documented here. Check it out. And that just determines the spacing between the items. So if we don't have this gap, the Y is very close to the edge of the other menu there. So that's why I put that gap there. So that's why we have this menu containers div, just so that we can style it. And I pasted this link to this reference example that we're going to make something kind of similar to. This is the example that I found. I just kind of like this layout because it has a label and then a UI element. In our case, we're going to replace these with selects, dropdowns. But the overall structure matches to what we want. So for each of our menus, we will have a div. And then within each of those divs, we will have a label. And then another div with these certain classes to make it the right layout. And then within that div, that's where we're going to have our menu. Or in our case, it will be a select. So let's implement this kind of a DOM structure with D3. Here's one way we can do that. We have menu container.selectAll div.row.data, and we pass an array where each of the elements represents one of the menus that we want, each of which has a label, a human readable label, and then another property called state field. And this is the field or property of the state that the menu will be driven by. So state.xcolumn or state.ycolumn. And then here, I'm using the long form of .join where we pass in functions for enter, update, and exit, but I'm only passing in the enter function. On enter, we append a new div, give it a class of MB3, which is margin bottom 3, and also row, which is copied from the example. And here's where things start to get a little crazy. You can use the .html method on D3 selections to actually set the inner HTML to be a string. And I did it this way just because it seems cleaner and more concise, and I kind of like seeing the HTML like this. I mean, you could do it another way where you have like .call and then you append a label, and then you have .attr class is this, that, and the other. .text is d.label. But I just thought it would be more clean and concise to do it like this. This approach lets you kind of scaffold out the DOM structure that you want in the enter phase of the general update pattern. And then for things that are dynamic, you can select those things later on. But first of all, this HTML is setting a label where the text of the label is d.label, which is, for example, x or y. And that's because this is a function that takes as input d, which is one of these objects here. And then we create a div with the Bootstrap class, and also another class that I gave it just so that we can select it later, which is menu container. Okay, that's how you can sort of scaffold out a DOM structure based on data. Now let's make the dynamic menus within this structure. To do that, we invoke .each. .each is a method on D3 selections that lets you pass a function that will be invoked for each of the DOM elements that are in that selection. Notice how it's using the old school function syntax rather than the fat arrow syntax, because the fat arrow syntax defines this to be lexical this. So it's not what we want. The .each method actually sets the value of this. It binds the value of this. And in JavaScript, the this keyword is a very mysterious and kind of sketchy thing, but it's used in the D3 API in the following way. Like many of the other methods on D3 selections, .each accepts a function that will be called for each row of the data array. This code here uses destructuring just to get at the label and state field that's defined here in this array up above. But in addition to that, we also get this defined as the DOM element itself that we're iterating over. So what that lets us do is say select this to get at the parent div, and then we can select within that this div, which is the menu container. So at this point, we are selecting that empty div so that we can use .call to call this menu function or component that I sort of crafted from the previous example. I'll show you that in a second. And we pass in a bunch of options, namely we give it access to state and set state. We tell it which state field this menu is tied to, and then we give it the menu options. Now let's take a look at how menu is defined. Menu is imported from /menu, so we can go over here and open it up and see that it is a function that accepts as the first argument a selection, a D3 selection of perhaps a div element. And then we destructure the various options. And this is pretty much the code from the previous example, but modified to be more generic. We create the menu, which is a select with a class of form control. And then when we listen for the change event, instead of setting the some sort of hard-coded field, we use the dynamic state field, which could be X or Y or color or something else, depending on what you pass in as the state field. So let's say state field is X column. That's the same thing as saying X column like this. It will be sort of replaced in there. That's what this syntax means. When you use square brackets for the key of an object, it makes the key that you're using dynamic based on the value of whatever variable you're accessing. So that's how we can make a generic change listener that sets a particular state field. And then, just like before, we fill out the options by passing in menu options as the data, setting the value attribute, setting the text attribute, and then setting the selected property. And in this case, we need this part because the initial selection, here, let me refresh the page. The initial selection has something different for X and Y, Volvo and Saab. So that makes it so that these get initialized properly. This is a scalable approach because all the logic for the menus is just defined once in this one file, and it's generic. So you could very easily just add more menu types. Like, let's say I wanted to have a color column that we initialize to, menu options at index2.value. All we would need to do to make a menu for that is to add another object where the label is color and the state field is color column. And there it is. It's there. Somehow the color text is not quite right. Is that this call sm2? If I remove that, what happens? Okay, this is kind of a tricky thing that comes down to sort of traditional UI development. Like, maybe instead of using the Bootstrap grid system, which is what this does, it says, okay, it's going to occupy 2 columns in a 12-column layout. If I make that 3, we can see the whole thing, but then I don't know, it's not quite the layout that I want. So I wonder, could I just make the parent display flex? And there are flex utility classes from Bootstrap. If I just say dflex, it makes it display flex. So what if I just make that dflex? Well, we need to make this selector more specific. Let me say it gets a class of menu container regardless, just to satisfy the selection. Now we can be a little more flexible here and say dflex. Now, what if I just get rid of that class? Oh, that needs a dot. Oh no, there's a conflict with the menu container. I'll just call it menu, I guess. Okay, that looks pretty decent. Although now there's like no gap between those. So what if I just set the margin with the class ms2? That means margin start 2. Okay, that just puts a little gap in between them. Okay, I think this is pretty much what I wanted to see. Okay, great. I'll make it just a little bit more. ms3. And I notice we're not getting those little arrows. I think because I'm using this old class. Make it form select. There we go. Okay. That looks pretty good. And then we can add color to the message as a final step here. We can unpack color column and say you've selected this thing as X, comma, this thing as Y, comma, and this other thing as color. And that other thing would be color column. Okay, great. So I think this is working properly. All right, that's one way you can make multiple menus with D3. I hope this will be useful to you in your visualizations.